when I was in my 20s, I thought my role on the board was to get everyone else to see it from my perspective. Now I'm really aggressively trying to see it from their perspective.
Welcome to Boardroom Confidential, a podcast by Sherpany where business leaders tell the stories they usually only share with their peers. Each episode, we have 3 items on the agenda: pressure, lessons, and boardroom dynamics. I'm Emily Sheffield, broadcaster, founder, former newspaper editor, and board member. And I'm looking forward to sitting down with senior leaders to talk about what really goes on behind the boardroom doors when the pressure's on and the stakes are high. Joining me this week is Roei Samuel. Roei is an entrepreneur and board member who says he is on a mission to lower the barriers to entry for those who want to build and scale a business. In 2014, he founded Real Sport, a computer gaming news site, and 5 years later, only at the age of 26, he sold the company to Gfinity. He's now the CEO and founder of Connected, a platform that connects startups with experienced executives and advisors. Roei has served on boards as CEO, non-executive director, and as an advisor. One of his advisor roles was with the board of ETA Technologies, a company that uses psychometric AI technology to assess startup teams. Welcome to the podcast, Roei.
Emily, thanks so much for having me on.
Now, we've got so much to talk about, but first on the agenda is boardroom pressure. You founded your first company at just 21, Real Sport, and you sold it when you were just 26 years old. In those early years of setting up your company, when did you first set up a board? Why? And what early lessons did you learn from setting up that board? What would you do differently now?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Emily. So I got very fortunate when I was building Real Sport. As you said, I was 21 years old. I really understood some things, and I totally did not understand most other things. So I was really great at building content and building technology and how to get that technology into market. I didn't know the first thing about governance. I didn't know the first thing about the boardroom at all. And in a very, very serendipitous, fortunate meeting, I met a very, very experienced angel investor who ended up investing into Real Sport, a guy called Nigel Ray. Nigel was a very early investor into Domino's Pizza, Nutmeg, the private bank. He was the owner of Saracens Rugby Club. Really, really experienced board director, chairman, angel investor in the UK. And very early on, he helped me understand the need for proper governance. Because I think as an early stage founder, especially as a first time founder, your natural inclination towards what a board is probably quite negative. You know, a board sounds like something which is going to slow you down. It's bureaucratic. It's a necessary evil is probably how you look at it. But when I had the fortune of having such an experienced angel investor and board member join my cap table, who was then able to help me understand that the board is a shield, and it's a mirror rather than a bureaucratic bump in the road, then I was able to understand why it'd be valuable. And that's how I came to forming my first board.
How did you form your first board? How many board members did you have on it? And this investor, how did he advise you on who should go on that board?
Yeah, absolutely. And he was very, very forthcoming with that advice. And the initial board composition was myself, my co-founder. So we had 2 sort of executive directors on the board. We had Nigel and his investment manager, so sort of investor director and investment manager, and then a further non-exec as well, which was really, really useful in understanding the breakdown of those roles. And some of the early lessons that I found out, I wouldn't necessarily say the hard way, but I certainly found out through trial and error, is that you have to really build for chemistry rather than credential. At times it was really clear that although we may have had someone on the board early on who had been there and done it, it didn't necessarily mean they were a right fit for the specific board that we had. So that was a really interesting early lesson, was chemistry rather than credential.
You sold your company. You were acquired when you were just 26. That was, 5 years. at what stage did the board sort of kick in with helping you with that acquisition?
I'll add to that. Not only were we acquired after 5 years, and I was incredibly inexperienced in everything, basically. It was a PLC that acquired us, so the level of like rigor and due diligence that went into that process was insane. Set me up very well for Connected, but it was really really insane to go through that process with a PLC. The CEO who acquired us at the time, a guy called Gary Cook, who was the ex CEO of Manchester City. He was on the board of the UFC and had been involved with lots of big M&A. So it was a very very intense process. And I think what the board helped me see is that you have a bit of illusion of control as a founder when it comes to the board, or as a CEO when it comes to the board, but it's not really about the board controlling things. It's about them being that mirror. So during that acquisition, suddenly the boardroom dynamic shifts, right? Because people are now thinking about an exit event, a transaction, rather than longevity, rather than how are we thinking about things internally over the next 2 years. And then also you see during that acquisition process how the role of the investor director becomes very important on the board as well. Someone who's there primarily representing the interests of minority shareholders, smaller shareholders. Is this the right deal for us? Should we be doing this? And again, it adds a different dynamic. Whereas maybe there was more cohesion, more alignment before, now there needs to be much more devil's advocate, challenging, pushing from that specific role as well.
What advice would you give a young founder going through that same process now, and how they should manage their relationship with their board?
Information asymmetry is something which I see a lot in boards, and I see a lot of founders make that mistake where you have a different type of relationship with one board member than you do another. One knows more than the other does, one feels a bit out the loop. And then when you get into the boardroom, that asymmetry really scales and can lead to a lot of friction and a lot of negative interactions and dysfunction. So that's something I again learned the hard way, is normally the best lessons are learned. And I think you also need to have real boundaries early on with your board, especially if you have ex-operators on your board where they are naturally inclined to getting involved and wanting to execute. But that's not the case. The executors are the executors, and the board is the reflection. It's the governance, and you have to be very very clear with that delineation, and not in a egotistical way of calling someone out during a meeting, but after a meeting, taking someone to the side, saying, "Look, I really respect, your opinions, and thank you for that. But this is the dynamic we're trying to create. These are where the battle lines are between this, during this, massive challenge of taking the business to the next level," which I think is good. And then I think you also want to avoid yes men, or yes people. You've got to make sure that there is strong, I don't want to say adversarial opinion, but the board has to not be about making decisions. It's about shedding light on other perspectives. It's about playing devil's advocate with the decisions being made at the executive level. And I think, those would probably be the three key pieces of advice I'd give to a young founder going through it for the first time.
And in terms of that information asymmetry, what's the way to get around people, not having the right information? Some people having more than others.
Yeah, I think you need to be obnoxious with levels of documentation. It's probably the way to put it, right? Is you need to be really, really over the top. I think the board pack is an overlooked art, right? I think it's so, so, so important. And I think actually now, you can use very, very clear tracking tools for this. I think now in 2025 and beyond, there are no excuses for not having that regular flow of communication. It was different back in 2014, where I think things felt a bit more formal. But now I would say that, yeah, board packs, regular updates, and try and build informal relationships.
Agenda item number 2 is boardroom lessons. Early in your career, post sale of your company, you became an angel investor in 2018, and you also joined the board. I understand things didn't go quite as planned.
That's a really diplomatic way of putting it, Emily. Definitely, a very nice way of putting it. It went pretty much as far off plan as anything can go. I was young, I was inexperienced, I was naive. I had the total of one business worth of experience in my life at that point, and that was my own company, and we got very fortunate with that, right? We took that to exit. So I had an opportunity to write a large angel check into a company and a sector that I was really passionate about. It was a mental health technology company helping employers improve and monitor the mental well-being of their employees. So it's something I was really passionate about. I wrote a big angel check and I joined the board as a non-exec. I'd had a very positive experience with my board at Real Sport and with my non-execs. So I was like, great, this is going to be perfect. And I joined the board probably, I want to say May 2018, something like that. So maybe like 2 months after the full sale of Real Sport had gone through. By that time next year, we had found out that the CEO was cooking the books. All the money had gone. Nothing made any sense. I think it may have finally been finally gone through involuntary liquidation. Although with these processes, they tend to just drag out for years and years. But that was a really brutal experience and a very, very harsh lesson in the responsibilities and fiduciary responsibilities and risks that come with being a non-exec. And I was 27 and I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know about those things because I just didn't, to be honest. So it was a really, really harsh learning experience, very, very emotional, very upsetting. I felt very responsible because as a board member, there was 8 of us on the board. So it was a big board. We all felt very responsible. I learned so much during that really negative experience, which was a really difficult one. But yes, as you said, Emily, not quite to plan.
I've seen in my own personal experience very, very experienced board members where companies have gone wrong and illegal activities have been uncovered, and people can be extremely clever at hiding them. Um, but what could you advise others to look out for?
The reality of the commercial world we live in is there are some grifters out there. You learn that often the most difficult decisions at board level are not commercial, they're moral, and they're ethical. And it can be a very, very difficult and challenging thing on that side. But as you said, in hindsight, all of these things started to add up. And questions that couldn't be answered on the spot during the board pack, but were um, you know, mentioned within all these amazing, positive, exciting updates where, sometimes that positivity is used to mask not having an answer to something which might be quite critical. So I think it's that, I think a lot of that can only come from experience or sharing the experience there. I think we also need to closely examine the relationship between CEOs and chairmen. How, yes, they need to have a strong relationship, but what is the nature of that relationship? And how dependent is that chairperson on this role? Because actually, what we had in that situation was the chairperson desperately wanted to be on this board, and almost like the desire to be the chair of that board, the need because of their personal circumstances that we weren't aware of to be on that board, probably then cloud their judgment.
Now we're going on to our final item on our agenda, which is boardroom dynamics. You've played multiple roles across different boards, and we've just touched on this: CEO, founder, and non-executive director. How do these roles differ in practice when you're in the boardroom?
There is no one size fits all answer, right? And I think actually the nuance of the board and understanding that nuance, changing the way that you interact with it and changing the relationship that you have with the founder and CEO, depending on the nuance of that board and nuance of their psychological type, is actually what makes a really good board member. So I think there's quite a few things that go into that. My suggestion to any non-exec who is wanting to work with a founder is be that shield for them. Help them understand where a lack of oversight or a lack of investigation may harm them or the company in the future. As a non-exec director, you're just geared to think up that way. Okay, if we don't think about this, don't think about that. This isn't in place, equals bad. Founders don't necessarily realize that, and they're certainly ontologically not thinking about the board in that way. So helping the founder understand that actually the board is there for downside risk mitigation rather than just being an annoying thing that you do, I think is probably my biggest piece of advice to non-exec. And that's where I've been on boards where I've seen it go well and seen it go badly. I also think as a non-exec, you have to compromise on elements of your natural ways of operating, especially if you've been an operator before, to ensure that you are letting the execs do the execution, and don't overstep the boundaries. It's not about changing a founder's decision. It's about being that mirror to help them see the impacts of that decision as well. So those would probably be my best pieces of advice.
How has your approach changed from being a founder and sitting on the board, which I believe you do now, from being a founder and being on the board in your 20s? How do you think you are as a person?
It's a really good question. I think when I was in my 20s, I thought my role on the board was to get everyone else to see it from my perspective. Now I'm really aggressively trying to see it from their perspective.
With your platform connected, you're helping startups connect with experienced board members. What are the most common mistakes you see startups make when building their boards?
I think that big one is trying to solve for credential rather than chemistry, and I think you see that problem with startups throughout. I see a startup hire, their first hires, fresh out of McKinsey or Goldman's. I'm like, that's just terrible. It's just not the right hire at all. Like, you need to match the board and the exec team with the level that you're at. So I think it's really, really important to have that chemistry and really understand what you need from a board in the different stages. I think using advisors rather than board directors at the early stage is something which is often overlooked, and I think works well as if you're a director yourself. Taking on a formal non-executive director position in a very, very early stage startup can go badly, as we've discussed already. So therefore, board advisory is another way of looking at it, and something which we see becoming more and more popular as people want to explore that route without fully diving in. And then I think for startups as well, the biggest issue they have is access to expertise, to knowledge, to networks. Is not actually capital, it's access. So building a board, whether it be an advisory board or a board of directors, with access in mind, so access and chemistry over credibility and CV, I would say is that the right way to go.
I think that's brilliant advice. Absolutely brilliant. I've so enjoyed your insights, and I'm sure our audience have too. But we always finish with one final question. If you go back to your first board meeting, what would you tell yourself?
Listen more. I think they say 2 ears, 1 mouth for a reason, right? And I really, really believe that when you are inexperienced and you have these experienced members around you, really, really listen. So that would be my key piece of advice. Very, very clear in my mind, that one. Listen more.
Roei Samuel, thank you so much for sharing your boardroom stories with us and giving us your time and commitment, especially as you were talking to us from Mexico today in such an important sort of moment for your company. You've been listening to Boardroom Confidential, a podcast by Sherpany. Sherpany is a leading meeting management solution designed to meet the unique needs of the board committee and executive meetings. Find out more at sherpany.com and make sure you subscribe to the Boardroom Confidential podcast to hear more business leaders tell the stories they usually only share with their peers.